I'm Chang. I'm supposed to be the faculty director for the Year of China initiative. So here I'm very quickly going to show you something what we like to do. See, most of you have heard about Year of China. And so here we sort of briefly stated the goal and what we would like to do and what we would like to achieve. And of course, in order to do that, the most challenging thing first is to come up with a logo. So we spent a lot of time working on that last spring, and it takes a long time to get us going. Okay. So here it is, a wonderful, beautiful logo, and with writing 中美交流. And with that, we set up a theme for this particular Year of China. First one is creating, discovering, and producing, which will touch upon culture, arts, history, science, and technology. And then we also want to end up with the unfolding future, which we will talk about various aspects of China. And we would like to look beyond the current state of affairs of how China is role on the world stage and look ahead to the future. In between, we also want to touch upon the idea of China in the world, and we coined the phrase opening doors and opening minds. And this leads to the program today, and which Chang will say Chang and Wang will lead the effort today. In particular, we would want to touch upon the impact of a century of Chinese students studying abroad, talk about the issue of Yue Shen. And so with that, I would like to turn this over to Chang, who will give us a little brief introduction on what we will do today, and how do I turn this off? Maybe it will be better.
So there will be more pictures as we go along. For the time being, I want you to direct your attention at me. I prepared a few remarks, and it may be a little bit more formal than the occasion requires. But I want to say welcome to you all, and tell you that my name is John Engwang, which I have on my name tag here. And for more than 50 years, I've been associated with Brown. In fact, I first stepped on this campus in the summer of 1958. And since then, I've been a student and on the staff and associated with the university in a variety of different ways. And although I was born in Connecticut, it is a common confusion that I am among the Chinese students who have graduated from Brown. So under the cover of this false identity, I have developed an interest in the history of Chinese students at Brown and Chinese students in the United States at large. Today's panel is, of course, a product of that interest, and it's also a product of the curiosity of Cheng Tan, who is the sort of the main producer of the Year of China, which he's already explained to you. Cheng and I both had the chance to read Ed Rhoads' book while it was still in galleys, maybe even before that. And our common colleague, Evelyn Hudahart, Evelyn, who was a student of Ed's at the University of Texas a while ago, said, you should read this, and we did. And I said to Evelyn then, we need to invite Ed to Brown. And not long thereafter, Cheng, who was involved in the development of the Year of China, had also come upon a book, Factory Girls, that had been selected as the first reading. So many of you have probably encountered that book as part of that program. And trying to remember what Cheng said to me, he said to me, you have to read this book. And then he quickly said, we need to invite Leslie Chang to participate in a panel about Chinese students coming to America. Well, I looked at the title and I thought, what is he talking about? And it took me a while to work through to the chapters where Leslie's life story and family history emerged as part of the Factory Girls narrative. And once I got to that part, it did become clear to me that she belonged on this panel as well. So Ed and Leslie are here because of Chung-Yi and my experience in reading some books ahead of time. But that only really covered a partial part of the century. And actually it's a century and more, and I'll get to that part as well. And we felt we needed to fill in the panel because there are some other experiences and viewpoints, and so much change has occurred in the relationships between the US and China, and particularly among the institutions, the colleges and universities, and the students who are lucky enough or unlucky enough to get to come here. So we have called upon a member of our faculty, Tang, who teaches in the physics department and has an office upstairs on the 7th floor here. Very nice view from his office, I might say. And also, in the course of organizing the Year of China, we discovered that there was a filmmaker on our campus who was interested in documenting the passage of students from China and their entry to Brown life and campus life here. And Yue Shen, Julia, as she's known in America, who's the producer of this film to be, has agreed to participate in the panel today and talk about her experiences. And so we've got the chronological passages more or less covered with the people on the panel, and I'm going to turn it over very shortly. But first I want to introduce, and I will introduce at more length as we go along in the conversation. I want to introduce Ed Rhoads to you, who was first in the terms of the chronological history, but also first in seniority among our panel. Okay? So Ed Rhoads is not as old as his subject. His subject is the Chinese educational mission. And the first students in the Chinese educational mission came to Massachusetts and Connecticut 139 years ago, if I'm doing the arithmetic correctly. And they would have arrived in Springfield, Massachusetts, probably 2 weeks prior to this date. And if they had moved to their families in Connecticut and Massachusetts, by now they would be enjoying the autumn weather of New England. They themselves were in new homes with their caretakers, people who had volunteered to accommodate Chinese students and to help them for a fee, actually, be fed and housed and experience schooling in the hometowns of small towns, actually some big towns in Connecticut and Massachusetts. So Ed brought to the task of studying this historical phenomenon, I think a unique blend of life experience, because he himself had grown up in China. He had been a colleague, a student colleague of one of our retired faculty at Brown, Jerry Grieder, and they were both at Lingnan University as kids. And he was educated there and then went on to, in later life, to earn a PhD in East Asian history at Harvard. But before that, he had stepped foot on the Yale campus and been an undergraduate at Yale College, which had also been the alma mater of Yong Wei, who was the first Chinese student to graduate from an American university. So Ed's pedigree, so to speak, admirably qualifies him to talk about the history of Chinese students in the United States, and he has produced, I think, the best documented, the most thoroughly documented narrative of these students, and he's going to take some moments now to share with you his experience, talk about the history of Chinese students in America, and then tell a little about the Chinese educational mission. So welcome, Ed Rhoads.
Thank you very much, John, for the invitation to come here, and secondly, for that introduction. In fact, the introduction is so fulsome that I may not have anything new to say, but I will ignore that and press ahead with what I was going to do. So, but let me see if I can do what I want to do here. Hey, we need tech support because that thing is not where it's supposed to be. There it is. Here we go. Here we go. I took the title of this panel to heart in thinking about what to talk about. And the title is A Century and More of Chinese Students Studying Abroad. And so I would like to talk about that. First about the various groups of Chinese students who have come to the U.S. or gone abroad to study, and then more particularly about the Chinese educational mission. The Chinese have been going abroad to study since the 1840s. Some went, which is where it's more than a century of Chinese going abroad to study. Some went with private support, others with government funding. My presentation today focuses on the latter group, those who went abroad with government funding. The history of Chinese studying abroad with government funding can be divided into 5 periods, which is what historians frequently do, carve up time into historical periods. Working backward in time, the most recent, or 5th period, began around 1979 with the initiation of the policy of reform and opening out, or Kaifang, and continues down to the present. During these past 3 decades, over 1.2 million Chinese students and scholars have gone abroad, with most of them coming to the United States. Of these, maybe 5 to 10% were sent by the government. Among them are students at Brown today and probably in the audience here. The 4th period of Chinese students going abroad occurred in the 1950s, when an untold number went to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, at a time when China was cut off from the West. One of them, for example, was Li Peng, who in the 1990s was the Prime Minister of China. Li Peng was in Russia from 1948 to 1955 and studied at the Moscow Power Engineering Institute. The 3rd period comprised the Boxer indemnity scholars to the United States from the 1910s to the 1930s. The funding for their scholarships, the Gengzi Pei Quan Jiangxuejin, came from the remission of a portion of the indemnity that China had been forced to pay to the U.S. for damages and loss of life during the Boxer uprising in 1899 to 1900. Between 1909 and 1939, about 2,000 Chinese students went to the United States as Boxer indemnity scholars. Among them was Hu Shi, who during the Second World War was the Chinese ambassador to the United States. He went in 1910 and studied agriculture at Cornell and then philosophy at Columbia, earning a PhD in 1917. The 2nd period, in the 1900s, during the last decade of the Qing dynasty, saw about 10,000 Chinese students flocking to Japan. They were drawn there by Japan's apparent success in modernization. as evidenced by its military victory over China in 1895 and then over Russia in 1905. Among this group of students was the future writer Yue Shen, who was in Japan from 1902 to 1909 and for a while attended a medical school in Sendai. Finally, we get to the first group of Chinese government-funded students going abroad. They went in the 1870s. By then, China had been twice defeated by the British in the Opium Wars, and the dynasty had been nearly overthrown by the Taiping Rebellion. China's rulers finally realized that if their country and the dynasty were to survive, reforms were unavoidable. The result was the self-strengthening movement, which began in the 1860s and continued to the 1890s. Among the reforms of the self-strengthening movement was the sending abroad of students. 38 students in 3 groups were sent to Europe in the mid-1870s to study naval and military matters. Among them was Yan Fu, who later on popularized social Darwinism in China. Yan Fu attended the Greenwich Naval College in England from 1877 to 1879. An earlier and larger group of students, totaling 120, were sent to the United States beginning in 1872. This was the Chinese Educational Mission, or the the very first group of Chinese government-funded students studying abroad, which is what I would like to spend the rest of my time talking about. The Chinese Educational Mission, or CEM, was the brainchild of Yong Wing. Born in 1828 to a farming family near Macau, Yong Wing, or Weng Hong in Mandarin, had attended a missionary school in Macau and Hong Kong in Macau and Hong Kong. In 1847, when the principal of the school, Samuel R. Brown, returned to the United States, he brought with him 3 of his students. One of them was Yong Wing. Yong lived with the Brown family in Munson, Massachusetts, and attended the local academy. In 1850, he enrolled at Yale, from which he graduated with a BA in 1854, becoming, as John mentioned, the first Chinese college graduate in the West. Yong returned to China and in 1863 joined the staff of the powerful provincial official Zheng Guofan, who was a vigorous promoter of self-strengthening. Yong's idea was to replicate his own educational experience on a grand scale and with financing from the government. He eventually persuaded Zheng Guofan to ask the Qing court to authorize the Chinese Educational Mission. The Qing court did so in 1871 and appointed Yong Wing an associate head of the mission. The CEM sent 120 boys to live and study in New England for a total of 15 years. Who were these boys? They were very young. Most were between 13 and 15 years old when they left for America. And these are 7 of the first group of boys when they landed in San Francisco in 1872. Nearly all of them came from Guangzhou and the Shanghai regions, the 2 places in China in closest contact with the Maritime West. This is a map that shows the native place of the CEM students, and you can see that most of them came from South China. And I'm trying to figure out this thing here. Here we go. Guangdong here, the Pearl River Delta, and then the lower Yangtze area here. Zhejiang, Jiangsu, Anhui. Hardly any of the students came from the scholar official elite of China, for whom a foreign education had no appeal. This was, after all, a time when the road to individual and family success lay through the Confucian-based examination system and did not require any foreign learning. On the other hand, few of the students came from among the rural peasantry either, since the CEM students were required to have had several years of education. Instead, most of the students seem to have come from an in-between group of fairly well-to-do families whose wealth came not from office holding, but from commerce, especially foreign commerce. Except for what they were able to learn in the few months at a preparatory school in Shanghai, the boys knew little or no English at the time of their departure. The 120 boys of the CEM went to the U.S. in 4 annual detachments in 1872 to 1875. 30 students in each detachment. This is, you can see a group of 30 young boys, either the 3rd or the 4th detachment prior to their departure in Shanghai. They went by steamship to San Francisco via Japan, and then by train across the American continent. Once arrived in New England, they were assigned to a number of American families who had volunteered to take them in. These families were evenly divided between Connecticut and Western Massachusetts, and none in Rhode Island, as you can see. As a general rule, each family was assigned only 2 students, and only 1 family was selected from each community. Here are a pair of students from the 3rd detachment, Liang Ru Hao and Tang Xiaoyi, assigned to a family in Springfield, Massachusetts. Being isolated in this way, much as Yung Wing himself had been when he lived with the Brown family in Munson, would expedite the boys' learning of English. The American host families were compensated by the Chinese government for their troubles. The chief responsibility of the host families was to get the boys in their care ready for regular American schools. And indeed, within a couple of years of their arrival in America, many boys were able to enroll in local schools, beginning with middle school and then going on to secondary or high school. Here is the graduating class of 1880 of Holyoke High School, and here's the other, the 2 CEM boys attending Holyoke High, graduating from Holyoke High in 1880. One feature of American schooling at the time helped ease their transition. According to education historian Theodore Sizer, recitation was the prevailing method of instruction. Prevailing method of instruction. The pupil memorized a portion of a text and dutifully repeated it to the teacher. This is the way the American schools were taught at this time. And this was a pedagogy with which the Chinese students were quite familiar from their Chinese studies. At the same time that they were learning English and attending American schools, the CEM students were expected to keep up with their Chinese. When they were still being homeschooled, and they were required to write 2 pages of Chinese every day and go to the CEM headquarters in Hartford for additional Chinese lessons every 3 months. This is the CEM headquarters in Hartford. The building no longer stands. It's now a parking lot. And here is the Chinese school at the CEM headquarters in Hartford. Later, when the students had started attending American school, they were to go to Hartford during their summer vacations for 2 or more weeks. Attached to the staff of the CEM were 2 Chinese instructors, and of course one of the instructors is this gentleman right here. Conspicuously, now by the fall of 1881, when the CEM students had been in the U.S. between 6 and 9 years, half of them had advanced beyond secondary school into college. By then, 3 had even graduated from college. Most went to Yale, Yung Wing's alma mater, the rest to 9 other colleges. And you can see that MIT had 8 students, Rensselaer Polytechnic 6, and then you have these others. In college, as in high school, the students had to choose between 2 types of curriculum, the classical and the scientific. The time-honored classical curriculum emphasized the teaching of Greek and Latin, while the scientific curriculum, which was a recent innovation, paid more attention to mathematics, the sciences, and engineering, and less to the ancient classics. Most of the students chose to study science or engineering. For example, all three who had graduated by 1881 had attended the Sheffield Scientific School at Yale. You notice here that at Yale at this time had an academical department, which was the classical curriculum, and the Sheffield Scientific, and about half attended had the classical curriculum, and about half had the scientific curriculum. And here's the graduating class of the Sheffield Scientific School, which was Yale's engineering and science school. And here's Ouyang Gung, and here's John Tianyu. Conspicuously missing from the list of the colleges that the CEM students attended were 1, Brown, and 2, the service academies. According to some accounts, one CEM student, Wu Zhongxian, did attend Brown, but this is not confirmed in the university archives. As for the 2 service academies, the CEM authorities had from the start expected that some of the students would attend West Point in Annapolis. According to the 1868 Burlingame Treaty between China and the U.S., Chinese students would be allowed to enroll in U.S. government schools if students from other foreign countries were so allowed. At the Naval Academy, between 1869 and 1881, a dozen Japanese students were in fact in attendance. So there were Japanese students at the Naval Academy. Such being the case, Chinese students should have been allowed to attend as well. Nevertheless, at a time of rising anti-Japanese, anti-Chinese sentiment, which was to culminate in the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, the American government said no. The American refusal to permit CEM students to go to West Point in Annapolis was one reason why, in 1881, the Chinese government decided to recall the students home, well ahead of schedule. You know, originally they were going to be here 15 years, and now after 9 years, they were sent home. Another reason was a change of leadership at the CEM headquarters in Hartford. By this time, Yong Wing had been transferred from the CEM to the Chinese legation in Washington, and a new commissioner, Wu Zidong, had been appointed. Wu Zidong was scandalized by how Americanized the CEM students had become. They had cast off their Chinese dress, and though they still wore their hair in a queue, they otherwise dressed in American clothes. This was the CEM boys early on, 7 of them in Northampton in Chinese dress. Here you have a dapper Qian Wenhui in American dress. They participated enthusiastically in American sports, especially baseball. This is the Orientals baseball team in front of the CEM headquarters in Hartford. They consorted easily and openly with young women of their own age. They attended church, and many converted to Christianity. This is a cartoon by a Yale student. What is interesting is this panel here. Here's a CEM student with the queue, walking arm in arm with a woman who's going to be an American. And they're going into this building. You can't assess here, you can't read it, but it's Battelle Chapel, which is a chapel at Yale. Here's a CEM student in class with a tutor, a CEM student at the blackboard. As I said, they attended church and many converted to Christianity. A group of Chinese students at Williston even founded a missionary society. And then they were forgetting their Chinese. So, the CEM thus came to a premature end in the fall of 1881. Here are the CEM students on their way home in 1881, 11 of them. These are kids who all of whom attended Yale. When ordered home, 2 refused and stayed behind. 6 went home, but then made their way back to the U.S. shortly afterwards. Most of the students on their return to China were assigned to various self-strengthening projects like the Fuzhou Navy Yard School, the Telegraph Administration, and the Kaiping Mines. Some eventually achieved prominence during the decade of reform following the Boxer Uprising. Several, for example, helped create the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship Program. One, Tang became the first prime minister after the establishment of the Republic of China in 1912. To conclude, how did the CEM students contrast with later groups of Chinese going abroad to study? First of all, they were a very small group, only 120 students as opposed to the 1.2 million Chinese who have gone abroad in more recent decades. Secondly, they were all men, there were no women in contrast with later groups. They tended to come from the non-elite sectors of Chinese society as opposed to, I think, the later groups. And they came from a wider swath of China, whereas the CEM students came mostly from Guangzhou and Shanghai regions. And then I think most strikingly, they were very, very young. Most were in their early teens when they left China. By contrast, Yan Fu was 23 when he went to England in 1877. Yue Shen was 21 when he went to Japan in 1902. Hu Shi was 19 when he went to the U.S. in 1910. Li Peng was 20 when he went to Russia in 1948. Tang Xiaoyi, on the other hand, when he went to the U.S., he was 12 years old. All these others were old enough to attend college on arrival abroad. The CEM students, by contrast, had to begin their formal studies in middle school. Because of their youth, the CEM students were less set in their ways and more open to new ideas than their later counterparts. At the same time, though, they were more susceptible to the blandishments of a foreign life, which is what led to the termination of this first government-funded effort at study abroad. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. So in 1881, there was a student from the CEM who might have attended Brown. And if he did, he certainly would have been the first Chinese student to come to College Hill. There are a variety of reasons we can speculate about why he never showed up, or at least in the official university records. But perhaps he had vanished into the underground because at that point all of the students were called home. Looking at the official records of the university, it's really not until the 1900s, the early years of the 1900s, that Chinese names begin to appear. And then again, Chinese names disappear almost as quickly. Many of them attending the Sheffield School at Yale, looking for a way to improve China and looking for the kind of technical know-how that I think propelled actually the Chinese educational movement, Chinese educational mission and its formation from the beginning. Its idea was to make China into a more modern place. And Yong Wing had his vision of what that might be, as did the leaders of China, the provincial leaders who connected with Yong Wing and others like him to create this movement and this momentum towards the export of young people so that they could gather skills and come home to improve the homeland. It wasn't until 1912 that a man actually graduated from Brown, who was Chinese. His last name was Bian, and Zuozun was his given name, at least as it's spelled in Roman letters. I've never seen his name actually in Chinese script. But he was the first, and actually that family continued to send people to Brown almost into the modern, into the contemporary era. a classmate of mine was also from the Bien family. But the Biens were just part of the beginning of Chinese students at Brown. And one of the reasons that I think the title might have been adopted for this form in the beginning, a century of Chinese students studying abroad, is that actually Zuen Sun Bien graduated in the class of 1912. And the centenary of his graduation is next June. Now, Brown's connection to the flow of students from China does not have a great and wide record, but there is a notable thing that happened in the 1900s, because after the end of the Boxer Uprising and the creation of the indemnity funds that were to repay China, repay the injured nations, the Western allies who had suffered injuries and losses in the Boxer Uprising. The United States created this indemnity fund that was made up of the surplus. We actually exacted war booty from China that exceeded the losses that Americans had suffered. And one of the prominent proponents of forgiving some of that amount that was overpaid was John Hay, whose name is on the library on the corner of College and Prospect Streets. He had served as Secretary of State. And it so happens that in 1918, even though there were no Chinese students enrolled at Brown that year, in September of 1918, there was an assembly of Chinese students in America on the Brown campus. And at that meeting, the ambassador from China, whose name was Wellington Koo went to Columbia, and he gave a speech in which he celebrated John Hay for his contribution to creating not only the indemnity funds and the scholarships that went with it, but also for his role in writing the open door notes, which at least in China at that time were celebrated as an advance forward in its foreign relations. Since then, there's been a lot of debate about whether the open door notes were imperialist or not. But John Hay was celebrated then, and Wellington Koo and other Chinese students were on the campus in 1918. The flow of students at that time was primarily courtesy of the funds from the Boxer indemnity, and also from various provincial governments which provided scholarships to students. And they came all in the service of China and looking towards the future as a better place. Now, that brings me to Leslie.
A better place.
Who also was not alive at that time. In Leslie's book, Factory Girls, where the title has nothing to do with study abroad, it so happens that a third of the way in, her family and her grandfather are depicted as people. Actually, her family is depicted as, a people who would be familiar with the lives of the factory girls, because they too had led lives as migrants. Their family history was tied to migration. And in particular, I think a miraculous discovery from the family archive was a diary that her grandfather had kept while he was a student in the United States. And I'm wondering if you would read for us a few passages from that diary and onto the paragraphs where it describes your dad's return home.
Sure.
Maybe I'll talk a little bit about why I decided to include my family story in this book about factory workers. I knew about my grandfather's story very vaguely from the time I was growing up, and I knew that he had left his farming village in northeastern China in the early 1900s. And of course, from a very different background than the young women who work in the factories. He came from a landowning family, and he was able to be educated. But what I found interesting the more I studied his story was that that moment in Chinese history around 1900, 1910 was very similar to this moment in modern Chinese history, in which the country was sort of poised between old and new. He was born in 1899, and when he was a child, the old imperial examination system was still in effect. He grew up memorizing from the 4 books and the 5 classics, studying the sort of very Confucian texts that people had studied for hundreds of years. But by the time he was probably in middle school, that was already changing, and the things he would study in a progressive middle school would be mathematics, geography, natural sciences, all the modern Western ideas which were very new to China. And as he eventually left his village in 1916 and went to Peking University for college. And another similarity with now was that he saw China's modernization as a personal project. It wasn't China's going to modernize, it was China's modernizing. What can I do? What can I do to be part of this? How can I prepare myself to be part of this new world? And when I was reporting in the factory town of Dongguan, I felt this among so many people I met, and you might think it very surprising, you meeting these young factory girls who don't have much education, but they're intensely studying English, or they're studying computers, or they're learning Microsoft Word. And when you talk to them, they say, you know, I want to become ready for the modern world. I don't want to be left behind, you know. So it's a very similar type of language, even though the background and the historical era is so different. As you said, I was very excited when I discovered that my grandfather had written a diary from his time in America. And I thought this would teach me a lot, not only about him, but about what America was like during this era. And instead, I learned a lot about what was on the mind of a Chinese intellectual during this era, which was almost exclusively Chinese politics, China's future, China's industry and business. So these are a few passages from his diary. This is different times during the 1920s. He was studying at the Michigan School of Mines, and he eventually studied mining engineering. And he was in America for 7 years. So this is January 26th. Zhang Zuolin has already set free Ivanov, so the Harbin question is temporarily resolved. The cause of the incident in Harbin was directly related to Feng Yuxiang's return to the Northeast. One man favors an alliance with the Russians, and the other with the Japanese, but each is pursuing his own interest. China still does not have a person who manufactures machinery. To have it begin with me in the future would be a most wonderful thing. January 28th. Manchuria and Mongolia have become one of the world's big problems. If we don't handle this properly, it will be hard to prevent their becoming a second Korea. This is the homeland of my ancestors. How can I offer it up to someone else? I swear that I will take the defense of the territory and the welfare of the people there as my own responsibility. March 4th. Jilin's forests are naturally suited for manufacturing paper, and Jilin exports large quantities of leather products each year, and even more of fur, while its railroads are very convenient. I will look into working in the paper industry. June 4th. If China wants to become prosperous and strong, it must develop its steel industry. Otherwise, it cannot resist the encroachments of foreign nations. Right now, its machinery relies entirely on imports. If a war begins and resources from the outside world are cut off, then China will surely be defeated. So in the course of my research, I learned that about 1/3 of the Chinese students studying in America in the first 2 decades of the 20th century majored in engineering, and my grandfather was very typical. So even though his background had been in Chinese classics, and traditionally in classical China, all the best scholars would study the humanities, he came to America and decided to study mining engineering. And throughout the diary, there's a lot of passages where basically he all but says, I hate mining engineering, but I have to study it to help China. So this is very much his focus. And I'll read a paragraph about what happened when he returned to China in 1927. My grandfather returned to China in the summer of 1927. On his first day home, his father organized a celebration in the village for his favorite son, who had brought honor to the family by going all the way to America. On the second day, the patriarch took out a wooden rod called a jiafa, used in traditional households to discipline children and servants, and beat my grandfather with it. In America, his son had switched from studying literature to mining engineering without parental approval. Never mind that his father was 7,000 miles away and understood nothing of the American university system. In a Chinese family, a father's word was law. The beating was so severe that my grandfather could not sit down for several days. So that's probably what I'll tell you about my grandfather. A lot of things happened to him during the war, and because of the civil war between the communists and the nationalists, he was assassinated right after the war in northeastern China. But moving on to the next generation, my father and his brothers and sisters with their mother went to Taiwan in 1949 as teenagers and eventually studied in college there. And then it came time for them to come study in America. And this time the motivations were, you could say they were different, but they were also mostly different. They were not thinking about China because they had already left China. They were now in Taiwan. They'd kind of lost their country. So they were thinking much more about career. But in many cases, they were still very much driven by obligation and family expectations. And I'll read a little bit about how they decided to come to America and what they chose to study. Sorry, I didn't mark this. My grandmother pushed her children to leave. She felt that Taiwan was too small. America was the only place for further education. But the journey by ship across the Pacific Ocean was too costly to be taken more than once. Every time she said goodbye to a child, she knew it was for the last time. An ocean away, her children continued to do what was expected of them. The girls had more freedom to study what they wanted. Nellie majored in education and Irene in English. My father, who had the sharpest tongue in a family of fluent talkers, was drawn to politics and the law. But the boys were expected to study science and engineering like their father, and like all the best students who went abroad. When Luke, who is my father's older brother, graduated from high school, his mother said to him, "What do you want to study? I hope you will follow in your father's footsteps." Luke agreed that he would. His mother gave him a book called Field Geology, a 30-year-old textbook that his father had used when he was studying in America. And that ended the only conversation Luke ever had with his mother about his future. So I was really excited to learn that I come from a family of really hard-ass people, which goes back several generations. But it was interesting because my grandfather went to study in America to modernize himself, but to modernize his nation, and immediately afterwards he went back to China. And in my father's case, it was because they'd already lost China. In many cases, he said to me, even though we lived in Taiwan and officially Taiwan was China, we never felt at home in Taiwan. So when they went to America, they stayed, partly because there was no home to return to. And then I guess the immigration continues in the next generation. Well, another part of the story is that as soon as China opened up, my father started going back. He went back for the first time in 1975. When Mao and Zhou Enlai were still alive. And ever since then, he had been going back regularly and doing a lot of exchanges in physics and material science and trying to do what he could to help China. So, even though he was driven very much by his career to go to America, he was also very patriotic and very, very concerned with the whole enterprise of helping China to modernize. And then there's me, who am only driven by my self-interests. And I went back, I feel very uncomfortable saying I went back to China, but I went to China as a journalist in the late 90s and learned about the place and my family history. And I think one of the reasons I focused on migrants was that it was something so different from my so-called intellectual Chinese family. This is something that no one in my family knew about, and I could be a reporter in China forever and I would never know about Chinese literature and Chinese history and Chinese food the way my parents do, but this is something that I could learn about that they didn't know about and many Chinese people don't know about. So that's kind of the way I sort of rediscovered China. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks. Now, if I heard you correctly, your grandfather went from the countryside to Beijing University, and our next speaker, Tang, also followed that path. From the countryside, he's a country boy, born a country boy, but he went to Beida, and during his years in college, there was an operation, a thing called the China-US Physics Education Accelerator, I think, something like that.
Examination.
Cuspia.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is a program that had been conceived in large measure with the advocacy of Chinese-American physicists, and was aiming to sort of repair the state of the profession in China after all of the difficulties of the Cultural Revolution. And it came sort of at a time when the U.S. and China had reestablished diplomatic relations. As a matter of fact, in some of the first meetings that occurred between U.S. and Chinese officials, the idea of educational exchange was broached, and there was huddling on both sides, and American officials came forward with a proposal that there could be educational exchanges, and they asked the Chinese, how many places do you want? And the reply was 500. And the Americans huddled and they said, how about 50? So that's where the number started. But Cuspia, which was a program that had 10 years of life, brought a significant number of physicists to the United States. You could see, I think, in our poster, the collection of individuals who came in one of those years. And Jay, you were in the 8th year, is that
Ninth
right?
year.
9th year.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's 1988?
88, yeah.
1988.
Yeah.
So if you remember, or were alive even, during those years, 1988 was sort of a watershed time, because in 1989, the collection of protesters in Tiananmen, came to the world's attention, and China changed quite dramatically, and I think quite forever as a result of that incident. Jay was in the United States at that point, so there were a lot of choices that he had to make, some political, some that were related to his career advancement. And I wanted him to talk about his education, his coming to the United States, why he might have done that, and sort of how things have worked out given all of the changes in the world that have occurred since then. Jay.
I don't have any script, so that could be a good thing or bad thing, right? I'm gonna try keep it brief. So I'm sort of a test dummy, I guess, Julia too, right? So I've been told when I was invited to participate in the panel that I actually represent a generation of Chinese students studying in the U.S. In a way, it is true because I've been in the U.S. for 23 years, and so my journey of coming to the U.S. Was really not, that scary a leap in my mind than it seems to be, because I was born and sort of grew up in the countryside, and in a really very remote farmland. So for me, it was really an interesting time, because I went to middle school at 1977 or something, and then about the same year where Deng Xiaoping came to power and Mao passed, and the country realized they want to bring education back. And so it's about the time where you could actually find a decent textbook again. And of course, you don't have choices, at least textbook, provincially been provided, countryside, other cities. So it was sort of the precious few years as a country boy. I was had sort of access to the same textbook as people who, students who grew up in the cities. So, and I did very well, and it's purely accidentally, I think, because I was a very young kid in the farmland. Usually, kids will go to school at a later age than in my case. And then I was told I went to school because there was nobody at home to take care of me. So my one of my older sisters was 2 years older than me, and it was, her year to go to school, so I just tagged along as an unofficial student. So years passed, and the school forgot about that sort of history. I became a real student. And I was never so good in Chinese literature, things like that. But I really had a love in science, math and sciences. And I just loved the subject. And then so perhaps because of that, I actually did really well in the exam to progress to high school. And then I had a really difficult choice because born in the countryside, my mom was, dying trying to get me to a professional school where I would change my farmer's descendant status for I would be able to have a steady job like a post office or things like that, or be a teacher in the middle school, and then you have a guaranteed job if you go to professional school. But I sort of took a stand, and my father supported me at that time of wanting to go to college. So I went to high school. It was a boarding school, and so it was a really tough transition because the boarding school now is probably 1 hour by bus, but at that time it was several hours by bus plus 2 or 3 hours of walking, carrying your school bags and belongings. So so that was the biggest transition in my life. And then when I was ready to go to college, of course you have to pass this one national entrance exam. You have to do really well, and you have to make your choices before you knew how well you did. So I thought, what the heck, I want to see the world. So I put my first choice as Peking University instead of a very good university in my home province. So I was admitted to Peking University. And because of my limited exposure to the intellectual world, I had no idea about going abroad my first couple of years in college. So it was really my third year. And then, I kind of learned from my friends, a lot of really good students were preparing for taking part in this exam of going to the U.S. for graduate study. So I sort of thought, okay, I was doing well in college, so I might as well just study and see what happens. So I took that test a couple of times, and then in 1987 I passed the test. And I think that year there were like 70 students in the entire country who were selected. So I wouldn't tell you my actual ranking, but there was a little embarrassing story behind it. I think I did very well in physics, but I flunked the English test, but I was only missing 1 point toward being the passing grade. And so they actually determined that was okay because physics came first and English, something that I could catch up. So I came to the States. I did my PhD at Brandeis University, and to my surprise, of course, many things changed the year after I came to the States. There were a lot of student uprising in China, and my college friends were on the street, and a lot of demonstrations. And we sort of, as Chinese students in the U.S., got also excited. We participated in demonstrations. I remember one demonstration we went to Washington D.C., and a big group of Chinese students, and then some local people were very sympathetic and tried to talk to us, with very friendly terms. So they asked us which school we came from. So I said I came from Brandeis. And then the particular gentleman I spoke with actually had no idea where Brandeis was. So that's sort of interesting. Anyway, I spent several years there, did my PhD, and that's the time I went through really a painful transition because when I came to the States, you have the idea of wanting to save the world, right? You want to, do well and study and become an established professional and, go back to serve China, right? Helping the country, which I, got the opportunities to go abroad to begin with. But then it was very unclear whether or not it would be any guaranteed safety if we ever returned. So I actually didn't go back for a visit for about 5 years until I felt, you know, you just have to take the risk, you know, and see what happens. But then, since then, I find myself more grounded in the United States professionally and also, you know, in terms of life prospect. So I've been going back sort of once every year or two, but never again as sort of, you know, a long-term return, but always as a visitor now. So every time I go to China and I have to apply for a visa, I have to state my purpose. So most of the time I go there for, you know, professional reasons, but I also have college friends and siblings. I would go visit them. And my latest, I'm going to China in 2 or 3 weeks, again, to a conference. And then in the visa applications, you are supposed to check these boxes and say, you know, scientific meetings, visiting friends, you know, tourism or something. So I choose all 3 or 4 boxes. My travel agent advised me very sincerely that you shouldn't be choosing so many boxes. So, you know, which box do you want not to check? So anyway, so that's my brief story. And I have been at Brown for 8 or 9 years now. So, and just asking Leslie to sign my book, because she reminded me I'm also a migrant worker of a different kind. So I definitely relate to the factory girls, not only because I came from the countryside, and then, you know, sort of seen outside the world, but also, you know, in the sense that we all have very similar life experiences of stepping into the unknown and just sort of try to make the best of your own life. And then by doing so, I think you help the world. That's in a very small way. So that's how I feel, and I'm sure Leslie will never write a book about my life because I'm sort of settled now.
I was thinking about it, actually.
It's, you know, because, you know, I'm sort of settled here probably for quite some time, but you never know. So that's my brief story, and I'll be happy to talk to you guys more. Yeah, I probably should.
Thank you. Well, I feel like we're all auditioning so that Leslie will make us the subject of the next work. Our last speaker this afternoon is Yue Shen, who comes to us from Nanshi Fuzhong, right? So it's the high school attached to the Nanjing Teachers College, which, if you remembered your history lecture here, the famous author Lu Xun is also a graduate of that high school. So there was a long tradition of going outside of China, established more than a century ago, or a century ago. In any case, Julia follows in that tradition, and she, I think, also marks a change, maybe a new wave of Chinese students has materialized, you know, somewhere around when Julia, or maybe the class before her, came to the United States. Because there is an increasing number of students in China, of course, accessing higher education, but also an increasing number of students who are self-propelled as students who are coming to the United States through their own design. And I wanted Julia to tell a little about her own story, and then I know the room is filling up here because they're eager to see a small preview of a film that Julia and her roommate have begun to cut. And we're going to see the world premiere of the trailer. Okay? So, Julia, why don't you speak, and then we can turn the film on.
Okay. So hi everyone. Let me explain my name first. So my name is Yue, Y-U-E. A lot of people have a problem pronouncing that name. They always like to pronounce that Yu. So when they say hi, it's hey you. So yeah, that's why I prefer people call me Julia. Sounds much nicer, right? So let me start my experience with a story. So there's an international school with students all over the world. So one day, the professor is asking, what is your opinion about the lack of food in other countries? So African students are asking, what do you mean by food? European students are asking, what do you mean by lack? And American students are asking, what do you mean by other countries? And Chinese students are asking, what do you mean by your own opinion? Yeah. Well, I grew up with one opinion when I was little. That is, I want to go to the best middle school, and then go to the best high school, and then go to the best college, and get the best job, and live happily ever after. So you see, I'm definitely following my opinion, and that is why you see me right now in brown. Well, of course, that's not the only reason I came here. So when I was in high school, my opinion changed. At that time, I got more access to the internet, and there's more international events going on in China. I attended events like Global Model UN. I went to the Harvard conference in Shanghai. I also attended a small summer exchange program in the Princeton University. Those kind of international programs gave me the idea of the outside of the world, and also make me realize there are opportunities there that I can go out to explore. And at that moment, I was facing an important moment that I have to make a decision about what kind of college I wanted to attend. Apparently, I can choose to go to a Chinese college, but there's something special about China is you have to make decision about what kind of major you wanted to study before you go to the college. When you have no idea about what the majors are, what is that, you have no idea about what you're going to do, and you have to decide your major. There's barely any opportunity that you can change it once you start your college. So I was thinking, oh shit, I have no idea about what are these majors. So maybe studying abroad is a good idea. And maybe I will have more opinions after that. So I started to look at America, because here is a country famous for the free ideas, free thoughts, and everything about freedom. So at that time, well, I don't have much experience in America. I don't have any friends or family member here. Everything I can do about searching American colleges was on the internet. So what I do is apparently I put out a ranking list of American universities, the top 50 schools. So I went to the school website one by one to check them. One of my personal way to look at the schools was I love to look at the presidential address and look at what the presidents say to their students. One of the things I find very special is that students are encouraged to make a difference of the world, which is very different from China, because I was always told that I have to adapt what I cannot change about this world. So it's more about adapt. I don't have much opinion about what I should change after life. So that was a big, big shock moment when I say America is a place that you're supposed to make a difference at. And that is why I chose Brown, this place when students are all encouraged to make a difference. So that's my initial reason to come here. And I think that's also a lot of other my generation Chinese kids who came to America look for more opinions. And one of the things that we were thinking that we wanted to do when we graduate is that eventually when we go back to China, we want to bring more new opinions and back to China and make some difference. Opinions like, currently in China, people define success with your wealth situation instead of the happiness. So they define the successful people as the Wall Street people or the people working in the White House. But not everyone will be enjoying the 100 hours per week Wall Street working situation. And there's lots of tears in the White House, I would guess. But I do find that Americans, they define success, associate more with the happiness. They would be happy finding a job that they fit into it. They would be happy with a maybe less reputed job, but they're happy. They love to work there. They would be more happy with sharing some family time together, and that is very different from the situation in China right now. I was thinking one day I can bring all these new opinions back to China and people might be happier with the new definition of success. So also, I was thinking that since I'm the new generation coming to America, maybe I can make a film to let American public know who are these Chinese students in America right now. At the same time, I can put this film back to China to let them know what is our situation currently in America studying, do we like here? And that brought me to my trailer. Please enjoy.
Not international though. They're usually either from California or somewhere in the United States.
I don't really have any close Chinese international friends.
No, can't say I have.
I'm Blair.
Blair?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm Georgie.
Hey, this is my roommate. Her name is Apple. She's really cool, except she just bought a really ugly Vampire Diaries poster.
Well, I guess I feel like international students group together.
Some of them do form bonds with each other.
Coming from the same place, it's probably easier to find the same interests and become friends with those.
Feels like they understand like cultural cues, or they also just speak the same language.
But actually, we do want real people outside.
Yeah.
And sometimes I need to know like maybe we are shy or they are shy, so we really don't talk to each other.
And you have to be very bold. You have to like show what kind of person you are to them instead of being asked by them or like waiting to be taken into the conversation with them.
平时交朋友是不是这种方式，所以反而会觉得挺累的。就是你要总会，大学生都很酷嘛，你要是学会美国那个酷的方式，才能真正跟他们相处好。
So it's not just like an environment where you can just sit and then like act naturally. So I always have to try.
I'm Blair. I'm a freshman as well. I don't know what I'm going to concentrate in.
You have to really understand their pop culture, and then you have to watch TV shows that they usually watch. So there's definitely some jokes, and I had no idea about. But it's fine. I can tell jokes that they don't understand.
So he's talking about like, okay, joke every day or something in Chinese, which I don't. I've never.
非常认识法国人。
啊，你要吗？我介绍给你。
好啊，要不然我法语全对。
我觉得他长得特别像哈利波特。
然后他们家长就一路就嗨翻，你知道吗？我就拍了一路家长的手，然后我想我爸我妈没来，然后就特难过。然后我就在想，毕业典礼的时候可以让奶奶爷爷什么都来。
Thank you. Please expecting that next spring.
The panelists are all here. Their backs are to you. And I'm wondering if there are any questions that any of you have as a result of what we've talked about this afternoon. It's really been a panorama of experience, and I think we have the privilege of having some very personal testimonies to this, and some hard-earned historical narratives that talk to the long-term process that really encompasses the relationships between U.S. universities and Chinese students, And I think one of the things that we can observe from all of this is that this is a much more globalized experience. It's a transnational kind of process. And because it has so many sides, it also has many potentials, many that we haven't discovered at this point. So please, your questions? Anyone?
You can ask each other.
Could I ask?
Yeah.
Leslie?
Yeah.
You talked about your grandfather going off to Beijing. I read the book, but I don't have to remember. I don't remember that part of the family history. So you have to remind me. Where did he come from?
He came from Jilin, Jilin province, from a place called Liutai, which is near Jiutai, so it's kind of near Changchun, and kind of a provincial small place.
And when he went to Michigan, was he? Did he have one of the Boxer Indemnity scholarships?
No, he went on a provincial government scholarship.
Provincial.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And his whole and his entire education was financed by the provincial government?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and he stayed there for 7 years, but I think he did study for a number of years and then did kind of work internships for the last year or two.
And then when he went back to China, did he have to work for the provincial?
No.
No.
No, he went to
okay.
work for the national government.
Oh.
Yeah. No strings attached.
I was just curious. Imagine you have to check box whatever you want to see your friends when. But I would think you would be sought after to teach. Have you had many job offers? After you've been studying, you have so much knowledge that I would think you'd be with a red carpet.
I mean, every time I go visit China now, I try to put good use of the time I spend. So I give talks at different universities and build some intellectual ties, and I'm really settled in the U.S. I made it pretty clear that there are a growing number of Chinese scholars who sort of return for various reasons, opportunities, family reasons, and for my case, I sort of feel I have a pretty good job, and then I enjoy what I do. So it's Leslie mentioned something that I sort of resonate, which is really very American actually, because it took me many years to feel comfortable, to feel like what I do the best for myself is best for what I should be doing. Okay, and then that's not how we were raised to think that way. The Chinese way is you're supposed to, do your best, right? Serve the country and be patriotic. And now I'm a U.S. citizen, so I don't know who I should be patriotic to. But I think as a scientist, I'm a global citizen. What I do is really what I think is good. And our research discoveries we publish in international journals. Anybody can go look for them. So, so I feel happy about my work and my life.
I have a question for Julia. So I went to high school in Beijing and I graduated from international school. And when I went to the Brown acceptance party, I was very surprised to discover that I was the only international student and that everyone else who had been accepted in my year was from a local school. And I was wondering a lot of them were sort of pioneers, and a lot of them were sort of like the first people to come to Brown, or some of the first people to apply to like U.S. University. And I was wondering what is it about the U.S. that is sort of like initiating an interest in Chinese students, and what is it like to break out of the system?
So recently the system really was changed. I think 5 or 6 or maybe 10 years ago, it's very hard to come to America because of the visa issues, especially during the 9/11 period. I know lots of students who are accepted, but because of visa and because of terrorist reason, they couldn't came to America to study. But I think in the recent years, all of a sudden, the visa was really easy to apply. So that definitely make a big difference. And also, at that time, we had more access to, for example, taking the SAT test. Until nowadays, we still don't have the SAT test in China mainland, but it's easier for us to go to Hong Kong since Hong Kong is back, and there's the test exam there, so we get to take the SAT exam in Hong Kong, and that helps directly for the application. So nowadays, since this system changed, it's easier to come here.
Do you know a lot of people in your situation? Like in China, did you know a lot of people when you were preparing to apply to the U.S. that they were also?
There's definitely a large amount of people are doing that. Yeah. It's a tendency. There are more and more people coming right now. Also with the better financial situation in China, the colleges start to be more affordable, so more and more people decide to come.
How did your parents react to your choice?
Well, at the beginning, they were really, they were not support at the beginning. Apparently, we don't have any family member here. They don't know anything about the system here. And they think, oh my God, this is a horrible decision to come. But however, it takes me like half a year to talk with my parents to show them that I really wanted to come. And I think it would be a right choice of my life. And they did a lot of research about here as well. So at the end, they decide to respect what I made a decision for my own. So they were really supportive after that.
I just have to say, I was really shocked. It was a wake-up call when I saw people's responses to Chinese students being here. I mean, it's real responses as wake up, to think, and that's until we're advanced thinking here at Brown University, but to see people they want to have people speak the same way or this or that, and it was just a real wake-up call. And I was wondering whether you went to other parts of the community or different areas to see their response, as well as on the college campus to, just when, to open the door to other people, other people's impression or response to.
Sorry, I didn't quite get the end.
Well, just, the students didn't relate, or, with the Chinese students, but how people receive you, or, it just seemed like was it half door?
Oh, how do people accept me?
Yes, in your introduction, it seemed that the people were opinionated. It seemed like they found it a little difficult to communicate with people from China or whatnot in your film.
Yeah. Well, what you see in the film was two incoming Chinese students came to Brown. They were freshmen. At the beginning, it was always hard to involve into this new society, new language area. But later on, we gave the interview to the upperclassmen when they're senior year. Apparently, they've been evolving here very well. After 4 years, when they more adapted to the language situation, when they gradually know the American ways to make friends, we find our own friend circle here, and I find most of the upperclassmen are actually evolving very well here.
I'm pleased to hear that.
Jay, I wonder what you might have been thinking as you watched the film. Do you remember experiences yourself when you were a student?
Well, I came here as a graduate student already, so my experience was slightly different, although I was still among the youngest graduate students at that time. So, yeah, I mean, you're talking about a totally different culture. It takes really a long time to adapt to. And then likewise for Americans who grew up from this culture, right? And I do not expect people will, imagine the type of upbringings that I have experienced, right? So I think it's ultimately a communication issue. It really takes a lot to bridge cultural differences. And I would say Leslie and I sit next to each other. We really are sort of in the same generation, but in a way, culturally speaking, we are sort of one generation apart, because I've been reminded as immigrant American, Chinese American, and Leslie is the first generation American. So in terms of culture-wise, she's like my daughter, right? So who sort of was born in the
and
U.S.
You're my father, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm old enough to be. So the cultural differences, it's it's amazing. But that's part of humanities. You know, it's great when really learns by thinking about this, by talking with people from different cultural background and different, you know, upbringings.
And it's unfortunate too that the education system doesn't approach and have more classes, more education, or just, you know, something to, you know, to introduce people to you know, broader thinking or whatnot, you know.
Just one follow-up, a generation from now, for your daughter, is looking at Leslie, for your experience going back to China, could you say something about what's your expectation as well as Chinese expectation of you as a American Chinese coming to China, and were surprises, or there's some things you don't know how to reconcile the expectations?
Yeah, definitely it's a very complicated issue. You know, I'm often asked, you know, in the course of the reporting, how do people see you? And I think it depends very much on their own social class. You know, I felt like people who are very, very educated and worldly in China, they see me, oh, Chinese American, they know right away what that means. Okay, you look Chinese, but you speak Chinese, but you probably speak it badly, and you don't know all the literary references, you're very American, but you know, like they know what that world is. But that's a very elite group who's encountered people like me when they travel. And then there's sort of intellectual Chinese, and I often feel like, not to insult any intellectual Chinese people here, that there are often more political and identity issues that come up with this group. You know, people often challenging me, you know, are you American or Chinese? You know, do you feel like America should be the policeman of the world? And, you know, all these issues that I don't really care that much about, you know. So I think there's a lot of, you know, historical or emotional burdens that educated people in China carry, that they sometimes bring to conversations with me. And one of the reasons I really liked getting to know the migrant workers is that it becomes very straightforward and very matter-of-fact, the relationships and the conversations, and they don't really feel the need to bring in the Chinese-American relationship into our relationship, and they can just kind of relate to me on an individual level. So I was able to, despite our huge differences in economic and social background, I was able to kind of connect with them much more easily than I expected. In terms of my own relationship with China, I think that it's taken me a long time to figure it out. And you know, I think that China and America are very interesting in that they're very large countries. They're used to being very important, and they're each is in its own way very self-involved. America certainly, like you said, what does other countries mean? You know, America is only about Americans. And China, you know, certainly China has been forced to learn a lot about the world, but China for a long time has been used to thinking everyone else comes to us. You know, we don't need to go learn about anyone else, and now they're learning how to do something different. So to be a product of these two very charismatic, dominant, but sort of self-canceling cultures can be tough, you know, and I know a lot of Chinese Americans who grew up and they had vastly different found vastly different meanings of what their identity was. You know, some people just became totally American, some people were just embraced the American side, don't have anything to do with China, and that includes like my brother, you know, we grew up going to Chinese school, but he just never had any interest in going to China and learning about China. And then on the other side, there are people I would meet in China who are Chinese Americans, but are sort of more Chinese than the Chinese, and they're always, you know, defending the Communist Party and saying how great China is, and it's just, you know, it's offensive to Chinese people to have a Chinese American person saying some of these things, you know. So you kind of try to find a middle ground between those two things. And it sort of took me a long time, and I think it was only when I sort of went through this process of writing this book that I felt like, as I said, I sort of claimed a piece of China or a way of seeing China for myself. But I think each person has to kind of find it on its own. It's not a really easy answer. But, you know, I do feel that, you know, anyone who spends time learning Chinese and China, it becomes a huge emotional commitment as well as an intellectual one. But I do feel that because of my Chinese background and heritage, that there is an emotional tie that connects me to the place, that makes me I wouldn't say I'm patriotic, but that really makes me want the place to do well and to be really happy about the opportunities that people have now. And so, that's probably the Chinese side of me coming out, even though most of me is American.
Well, you have seen China for a long period of time. What's your looking ahead? What do you think is going to happen?
Oh God, how would I think? I mean, that's the nice thing about being a historian. That is that we look behind, we don't look ahead. What happens will happen, and then I'll tell you why it happened the way it did. But as to what's going to happen, who knows? I mean, it's
the more they change, the more they're the same.
No.
No. Yeah. I mean,
It needs to be addressed. Has to be more documentary and education, so people will understand and communicate. I think that was a whole missing.
It really is amazing, though, the amount of change and direction of change in the last 30 years. I mean, no one 30 years ago could have predicted what China and the world would be like. So it's
What in the changes that you have observed, what's been most what stands out most in terms of how you imagine?
I have to say, I think probably it's really the rapid increase in the standard of living. I mean, that's not necessarily a good thing because it's brought with it this increasing inequality, social inequalities. But again, I grew up in China, but then I didn't go back to China until the early 80s. And just thinking back on what China was like, I lived in Beijing for a year at that time, and just thinking back, and I lived in a foreign ghetto, in a foreign dormitory at Beijing University, and didn't really have that much contact with the local population. I did have some, but just thinking back to how people then lived versus how they live today, I think it's just the standard of living, my current interest is the history of the bicycle in China, and back then, bicycle was king, and bicycle today is just nothing. I mean, it's the cars have taken over. Again, it's not necessarily a good thing. But, and I think maybe that the other thing is that there is, I think, a lot more freedom in China today than 20, 30 years ago. Not complete freedom, not necessarily political freedom, but just... It used to be that to get into a university campus, you had to be a member of that school, and have a little badge that identifies you as such. Otherwise, you couldn't get in. And now it's much more like you can walk into somebody, a pedestrian with no connections to Brown, can just walk right onto the campus and without any problem. So I think that the freedom of movement and the freedom to go to schools and go abroad.
Let me ask one more question, Julia. You've been here for several years now. What has surprised you about America from your expectation before you came?
America?
Yes.
Surprised me the most? Ooh, I have to think about that. I think one of the things that really surprised me the most might be how friendly people here and how open they are, how open-minded they are. At the beginning, I thought it would be really hard to make American friends because I feel like I always see the situation that Chinese students are grouping together and American students are grouping together. So I was thinking, oh, they must not accepting us, or there might be some reason that we couldn't involve in. But 3 years after, I find that they're actually extremely open-minded and their friend circle are actually really diverse. There are so many times they were actually really intimidating by a bunch of Chinese students gathering together, because it seems like we're showing that we're not friendly enough. Just there's some moment that if we open communication and start to talk to them, we'll find that they're actually really wanted to know us, and we can really be really good friends if we sit down and start to talk. They're very open-minded. A lot of things here is open-minded.
Well, thank you all for coming. And if you want to continue the conversation, which we will get a chance to do as we're going to be together for a while, please come and ask. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jeff, for wonderful.